April 21st, 1991. The New York Marriott Marquis for the 1991 edition of the NFL Draft. On the clock with pick number 23 were the Miami Dolphins. This was a team that went 12-4 during the 1990 season, making it back to the postseason for the first time since 1985. However, they lost in the divisional round to the eventual AFC champion Buffalo Bills. Entering the 1991 season, expectations for this team were sky high. They had Dan Marino at quarterback, who was still in the prime of his career, and they had a defense that was the fourth best in football the year before. But they had a weakness. Their wide receivers were lacking. Mark Duper, at the age of 31 years old, was the only player on the team with more than 450 yards receiving the previous year. Their top three receivers from a reception standpoint were all on the older side. Mark Duper was 31, Jim Jensen was 32, and Mark Clayton was 29. They needed to start thinking about their future and get a bit younger at the position. So the Dolphins did something that they've never done before. Since Miami entered the American Football League as an expansion team in 1966, they had never drafted a wide receiver in the first round. They had made 24 first-round picks before, drafting Hall of Famers like Bob Greasy, Larry Zonka, and Dan Marino, and drafting busts like Rick Norton and Sammy Smith. But they had never drafted a wide receiver before in round 1. That all changed on this day, because on April 21st, 1991, with the 23rd pick in the NFL Draft, the Miami Dolphins chose wide receiver Randall Hill out of Miami. They had their guy. They had their receiver that was going to help them out for the next decade and help the transitioning process from the old guard at wide receiver. Hill went to high school in Miami and went to college at Miami. This was the hometown kid. This was a match made in heaven. Randall Hill was going to thrive with the Dolphins. He was traded away after one game. This is the story of the time that the Dolphins drafted a player and subsequently traded him after just one game. How did we get to this point? How did we get to the point where the Dolphins traded away their first-round pick after one game? Well, we first need to start with the build-up to this draft. Randall Hill played his college football right down the road at the Orange Bowl, playing for Miami. After starting off as a defensive back in 1987 and featuring primarily on special teams, where he set a school record at the time for kickoff return yardage, he transitioned over to the offensive side of the football for his final 3 years. In those 3 seasons, Hill had 107 receptions for 1,643 yards and 11 touchdowns. However, his biggest reception had to be this play right here from a 1989 game between Miami and Notre Dame.
Maybe a touchdown. I call a touchdown if I were the coach, using the simplest call.
Randall Hill out there. First down, Miami.
That's what I would call.
In case you couldn't tell, Hill was fast. Very, very fast. And naturally, he tested very well when he entered the NFL Draft. He officially ran a 4.34 at the 40-yard dash, but during a private workout with the Dolphins, improved on that and ran a 4.29. At the Senior Bowl, Dolphins head coach Don Shula said that he was amazed at the Senior Bowl practices. Every time he ran a route, he got open, whether it was short, deep, or whatever. And the director of college scouting for the team, Tom Heckert, was impressed as well. By the time that the draft rolled around, it was clear that the Dolphins were going to take a receiver in round 1, whether it was Hill or his teammate, Wesley Carroll. I'm actually kind of fascinated by the coverage surrounding this, because the Dolphins had pick number 23, and yet media outlets were saying that the Dolphins were going to draft one of these players like it was a surefire thing, even though teams could have easily traded up or the Dolphins could have traded back. But it was painfully obvious that the Dolphins needed a receiver. They needed some help for Dan Marino. Marino was in the prime of his career, and I made a video about him a while ago and his unbreakable record if you want to check that out. While Marino was in the prime of his career, his receivers were not. As one writer said, the Dolphins' corpse of wideouts, the team's principal weapon, is in need of new blood and fast. At the time, their top 2 receivers were on the wrong side of 30. Mark Duper and Mark Clayton were good, but were on the older side. The rest of the cast didn't inspire a whole lot of confidence. Tony Martin was drafted by the Jets in the 5th round of the 1989 NFL Draft, and made his way onto the Dolphins in 1990 with an unimpressive season. Fred Banks could not stay healthy. and was also going to be 29 years old by the start of the season. Scott Schwades had a grand total of 19 receptions over his 4-year career at this point, and Andre Brown had a grand total of 3 receptions in 1990. This receiving unit needed a lot of help. So it seemed likely that the Dolphins were going to take a receiver with their first pick in 1991. And that's exactly what they did. They took Randall Hill with their first round pick, taking a receiver in the first round for the first time ever. As head coach Don Shula said, when you've got Dan Marino, you've got to give him enough weapons to utilize. You need all the talent you can get out there. So we're going to find ways to utilize Randall. His speed was too much to pass up. And scouting director Tom Heckert defended the pick afterwards, saying other people may have heard that stuff about Randall Hill the showboater, the lack of courage, to let that sway them. We know everything there is to know about Randall Hill. Clearly, this was not the case, because less than 6 months later, he was traded away. July 11th, 1991, the first day of training camp for the Miami Dolphins. Back when the NFL draft happened 3 months before, the Dolphins made 10 picks. At the start of training camp, all 10 of those draft choices had gone unsigned, including Randall Hill. Holdouts were much more common back then. But this holdout dragged on. It dragged on for 4 weeks. On July 26th, the Dolphins had their first preseason game, which was a home game against the Chicago Bears. He wasn't with the team. On August 3rd, the Dolphins played the Los Angeles Raiders in Tokyo as part of an international preseason game. Hill wasn't with the team. This holdout did not end until August 6th. After missing 25 days of camp, and after missing 2 preseason games, Hill finally signed with the Dolphins, taking a 3-year deal worth $2.1 million. After Don Shula expressed his frustration on August 5th, Hill was signed the very next day. Shula said that he was glad that the holdout was over, and that Randall had a lot of catching up to do, but they thought he could fit in a hurry. He did not. In 3 preseason games, Hill was pretty underwhelming. He had 6 catches for 70 yards, and did not find the end zone. Miami struggled that preseason, as Marino did not lead the offense to a single touchdown, and Hill couldn't fit in. As Shula said, it's evident that Randall is not ready to play. He really hasn't had a chance to pick up our system and be ready to play the way I had hoped. When week 1 rolled around, Hill was buried on the depth chart as a 3rd stringer. He got a play on special teams, returning 1 kick for 33 yards. But he saw no action on offense as a wide receiver. On September 3rd, 1991, the Dolphins traded Randall Hill to the Phoenix Cardinals in exchange for a first-round pick in 1992. Phoenix was thinking about taking Hill with their 6th selection, but they opted to take defensive lineman Eric Swan, a semi-pro football player who had never played college football before. As stupid as that might sound, it actually worked out. Swan played 10 seasons for the Cardinals and made it to 2 Pro Bowls, making it in back-to-back years in 1995 and 1996. But by the time the Cards were on the clock again, Hill was off of the board. The Cardinals wanted to get Hill in order to bolster their offense. Ricky Proehl and Ernie Jones were the team's top options, and Hill would provide a speed option as the number 3 guy. General Manager Larry Wilson said that you've got to have great players to have a great team. And I think Randall Hill is one of them. He is a flashy player, and he enjoys playing the game. He has fun out there. And head coach Joe Bugle was enthused as well, saying that when you get a chance to pick up a player as good as him, you've got to do it. Phoenix was feeling good. They just got one of the fastest players in football, who they maybe needed after only having 124 passing yards the game before. And they were coming off of a 24-14 road victory against the Los Angeles Rams at Anaheim Stadium, so they were hoping that the first-round pick wouldn't amount to much. As for Miami, they were looking ahead, ready to cut their losses. Shula said that now, the team could concentrate on improving the defense or focusing on the 1992 draft class. Spoiler alert on the whole, that draft class wasn't very good. It's not too often that you see a team give up on a first-round pick after 1 game. But did this move work out for both sides? Let's start with Phoenix. This did not work out too well for the Cardinals. Phoenix maintained at the end of the 1991 season that they had no regrets trading a first-round pick for Hill. But any way you look at it, 1 touchdown as a rookie is not impressive. Hill lasted 3 more seasons with the Cardinals, not doing much of anything. He finished his Arizona career with 174 receptions, 2,419 receiving yards, and just 8 touchdowns. And the Cardinals probably could have used that first-round pick in 1992. The team started 2-0, but lost 12 of their final 14 games, and ended the 1991 season on an 8-game losing streak. Phoenix finished with a 4-12 record, which would have given them the 7th pick in the NFL Draft. As for Miami, the team struggled, finishing the season with an 8-8 record and missing the postseason. However, it wasn't because of the offense. In fact, their offense was quite good. Miami had the 3rd most passing yards in the league, the 5th most passing touchdowns in the league, and the 6th most points in the league. The Mark brothers of Mark Duper and Mark Clayton improved from their 1990 campaign, with each of them crossing the 1,000-yard mark. Clayton, at the age of 30, even made it to the Pro Bowl that season with 70 receptions, 1,053 receiving yards, and 12 touchdowns. So they didn't really need Randall Hill. The old guard was not ready to quit just yet. With that 7th overall pick in 1992, Miami looked at improving their defense. Miami allowed the 5th most points in all football that season. Turns out, their opening game against Buffalo, where they allowed 35 points, was a bad sign of things to come. Miami allowed 35 or more points in 5 games that season, so they used their first-round picks on defensive players. They used pick number 7 from Phoenix on cornerback Troy Vincent, and pick number 12 on linebacker Marco Coleman. Both players had solid careers in Miami, and wound up making the Pro Bowl with other teams, with Coleman making it with Washington in 2000 after a 12-sack season, and Vincent making 5 consecutive Pro Bowls with the Eagles from 1999 to 2003. So what happened with Randall Hill after the 1994 season? In a strange twist of fate, he came back to the Miami Dolphins in 1995. Don Shula was still there when he signed. In 2 seasons with the Dolphins, he had 669 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns. In his final game with the Dolphins, he scored what would turn out to be the game-winning touchdown, catching a 50-yard strike from Dan Marino in a 31-28 victory over the New York Jets. Afterwards, Hill played 1 more season in the league, playing the 1997 campaign with the New Orleans Saints. A 7-year career is nothing to scoff at, but he certainly did not live up to expectations. We've seen teams give up on draft picks early on before. Just look at the Cardinals last year with Josh Rosen. But to give up on them after 1 game? That's something that we normally don't see. Credit to Miami for cutting their losses early on and getting something of value in return.